Imagine.
Hello everyone, I am Dark Imagine Master of Stories, and I am here to help you. Today I know you needed this video for sleep. Before that, like the video and subscribe to Dark Imagine, also where you from, and what time you watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Let's start with first story. The night it happened still feels like a nightmare. It was Christmas Eve, 1945, and the snow had been falling hard all day, covering the hills of our small town. I was just 18, but I knew the warmth of family like the back of my hand. We lived in a little house that sat alone by the edge of the mountain, surrounded by pines and the icy air that seemed to sneak in through every crack. My family had worked hard for what we had, and we were grateful. There were 9 of us in total. My parents, 5 of us kids, and the youngest 2, twins who were barely toddlers at the time. My father, George, was always busy, but he loved us all, even when we were loud, as we often were. This particular night, the weather outside was fierce, but inside, our home was alive with the smells of cooking, roast turkey, sweet potatoes, and pies, and the sound of us laughing as we wrapped gifts and shared memories of the year gone by. We were all together. But as the night went on, things took a turn that none of us could have ever imagined. I remember my father, George, had been fussing with the lights on the Christmas tree in the living room. Something about the wires just didn't seem right, and he was doing his best to fix them. My mother, Jenny, was in the kitchen, making sure the last of the food was prepared for the following day's family gathering. As the night wore on, we had all started to head upstairs, except for the younger kids. They were restless, running around with the energy of the season, full of that infectious excitement. At some point, I had decided to head to bed, thinking that I'd already said my goodnight and settled in. But then I heard it, the sound of a truck, a loud old engine. It stopped outside the house. It was strange, because I couldn't remember anyone being expected that night, especially with the road so bad. I crept to the window, not wanting to wake anyone else, and peeked out into the night. A figure was standing beside the truck, tall, shrouded in shadow. It was hard to see clearly, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved. I remember thinking, it might be one of the neighbors, perhaps delivering gifts or something else. But then, after a few moments, the figure got back in the truck and drove off, disappearing into the night, leaving nothing but a faint trail of exhaust in the snow. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later, I'd wish I had. Around midnight, I was woken by the sound of shouting. It was my father's voice, sharp and filled with panic. "The house! The house is on fire!" My heart leapt into my throat, and I could smell it. Smoke. Thick, acrid smoke. I stumbled out of bed, disoriented, and then the screams. That's when I saw the flames. The fire had started from the back of the house, and it was spreading quickly, like some sort of monstrous animal tearing through the walls. The heat already so intense, I could feel it on my skin. I raced down the stairs, the sound of crackling timber and falling beams filling my ears. I ran for the door, but there was no way out. The fire was blocking it, I don't know how, but I managed to crawl to the back door, which wasn't as engulfed as the front, and I managed to escape. I turned around just in time to see my father, Jenny, and a few of the older children making their way toward the front door. But then, a horrible realization hit me. The younger kids, the twins, they were still inside. I remember my father shouting for me to go to the neighbor's house to get help, but there was no time. By the time anyone could respond, the fire had taken full control of the house. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke thickened everything, making it nearly impossible to breathe. My father was screaming their names, calling for them over and over, but there was no answer. We couldn't get in. The firemen arrived after what felt like hours. But by then, the house had collapsed inward, a pile of burning timbers and debris. It took them 2 whole days to sift through the rubble. By then, hope was gone, and we never found them. The thing that makes it worse, the thing that haunts me to this day, is that the authorities couldn't explain what happened. They said it might have been an electrical fire, but they never could pinpoint the cause. There were no signs of the twins inside the house, no bodies, no traces at all. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving only the echoes of their last cries. As for that truck, no one ever found it. There was no record of anyone nearby, no strange vehicles at the time, and the man I'd seen, they couldn't find anyone who matched the description. It was like the fire itself had covered their tracks, erasing any trace of what might have really happened that night. The official story was that the children died in the fire, that they must have been caught inside when the blaze spread. But we knew the truth. And the town, well, they were never quite the same. Some said it was the work of a ghost. Others thought it was something more sinister, something we couldn't comprehend. It felt like something far more malevolent than just an accident, something that had come for us, and yet we were left with nothing but the burned remains of our lives. The years passed, and we moved on, as best we could. My parents never spoke about it again, but I couldn't forget. Every year, on that cold December night, I'd walk outside, the snow crunching underfoot, and I'd stare at the spot where the house had stood. And sometimes, I thought I heard them, their voices, faint, calling from the distance. No one could explain the fire, and no one could explain the truck. But deep down, I knew that night wasn't just about a tragedy. It was about something else, something we were never meant to understand. And that's the part that still terrifies me. Let's dive into second story of this time. It started in the winter of 2007 in a small village in southern Germany, a place surrounded by thick forests and winding rivers. The air was crisp, and the fog often clung to the ground like a thick blanket, especially on mornings when the frost was heavy. I had grown up in Heilbronn, and I always thought of it as a quiet place, a place where life moved slowly and people knew each other by name. But all that changed that year. It was late one night when the first murder occurred. A woman, young, just in her 30s, was found dead in her apartment. She had been strangled, and the whole village was stunned. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anything had been taken, just a body left in the middle of an otherwise peaceful home. The killer had left no trace, no clues, just an eerie stillness that hung in the air. The detectives on the case were baffled, and for a few days, the village was haunted by the sense of dread that no one could explain. Then, about a month later, the second murder happened. It was a man this time, in his 40s, found dead in his car, his throat slit open. Again, no sign of struggle, no fingerprints, nothing. But there was something strange. There was a small, inexplicable clue. A smudge of lipstick on the rearview mirror. It was the only thing that seemed out of place, and the authorities took it seriously. They thought maybe it was a witness, or perhaps even a clue to a connection between the murders. I remember that night very well. The snow had been falling for hours, and the streets were silent except for the occasional scrape of boots against the ice. I was working late at a cafe, one of those places where everyone from town gathered to gossip, and my boss, Stefan, was the one who told me about the clue, the lipstick. It struck me as strange, but nothing felt too unusual. After all, it wasn't like anyone could have predicted what would happen next. Weeks passed, and the murders kept coming. each one more disturbing than the last. A woman found in a field, another man in a park. There was always the same thing, no trace of the killer. The only thing they could link was the same type of lipstick mark, the same faint trace of a woman's presence. The police started to wonder if they were looking for a single person, a woman. But that was just the beginning of the nightmare. What started as a string of killings turned into something else. A pattern began to emerge. The authorities realized that the smudge of lipstick wasn't the only thing left behind. There was a fingerprint, a single perfect print, the kind you could never mistake. But it wasn't like anything they had seen before. The print didn't match anyone in the system. There was no record of it anywhere. And that's when the rumors started. People began whispering about the Phantom of Heilbronn, as they called her, a woman with a chilling ability to leave behind no other trace than that single fingerprint. At first we all thought it was just superstition, a way for the people of the village to cope with the fear. But the killings didn't stop. In fact, they escalated. The police had no leads. They sent the fingerprints to labs across the country, but nothing ever came back. Then, after months of terror, they made an announcement. They had found the woman, or at least, they thought they had. They arrested a woman, a local who had a criminal background, someone they thought might be connected to the murders. Her fingerprints matched the one left behind at the crime scenes. But something didn't feel right. The more they investigated, the stranger the situation became. The woman they arrested, her name was Maria Richter, had been in custody at the time of several murders. She couldn't have committed them. And that's when the police started to realize something horrifying. It wasn't just a single woman leaving the prints. It was as though there was an invisible hand at work, a presence that could take on the shape of anyone. I remember the moment when I first felt it, the unease that settled in like a heavy weight in my chest. I was walking home late one evening, the same night they announced Maria's arrest. The streets were empty, the fog swallowing up the light from the street lamps, and as I walked, I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind or my imagination, but then the footsteps quickened. I glanced over my shoulder and saw nothing, but I could feel it. Someone was following me. I picked up the pace, my heart pounding. The footsteps kept up. I finally turned a corner and ducked into an alley, hoping to lose whoever it was. And as I did, I felt a cold chill run through me. And then I saw it. A shadow moved across the wall, a figure, tall and slim. I didn't stop to think. I ran, my breath sharp in my chest as I raced toward the nearest street. But when I looked back, there was nothing. It was the first time I truly felt the presence of the phantom. Not just a story in the papers, but something real, something watching. Something that could take any shape, any form, and leave behind that unmistakable fingerprint. Over the following months, the murders stopped, but so did the investigation. The police were no closer to finding the truth, and soon, people forgot. The village returned to its quiet ways, but the fear didn't leave. Every now and then, I still see someone glance nervously over their shoulder, as if they're waiting for something to catch up. I've heard whispers from the old folks in the market about how the phantom still lingers, waiting for the right time to strike again. They say she's not a woman at all, but something far darker. Something that can assume any face, any body. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if I'm the only one left who hasn't forgotten. I wish I could forget. But every year, when the fog rolls in thick and the streets are silent, I've that chill. The unmistakable feeling that she's still out there, waiting. The phantom of Heilbronn was never just a name, and I know now that it's something far more terrifying than any of us could have imagined. Something we were never meant to understand. Let's dive into third story of this time. I'll never forget the summer of 1994. I was living in Oakville, a small town in Ontario, Canada. Oakville was peaceful, quiet, with the kind of charm you'd expect from a lakeside community. People there knew one another, and we'd all gather in the town square for fairs, barbecues, and summer picnics by the water. But that summer, something happened that changed everything. It started out so small, something that could easily be dismissed. But by the end, it had turned into something I can't forget. It was a Sunday morning when I first noticed it. I'd gotten up early, as I usually did, to take a walk by the lake. The air was still and cool, with just a light breeze ruffling the leaves of the nearby trees. It was one of those mornings when everything seemed calm, like the whole world was holding its breath. But then, as I walked closer to the water, I saw it. A strange, gelatinous mass had washed up on the shore, its texture almost translucent, like something from a nightmare. At first, I thought it was just a pile of algae or some kind of strange seaweed. But the shape, it didn't look right. It looked like it had come from somewhere far beyond the lake. I didn't think much of it at the time. The lake wasn't exactly the cleanest, so it wasn't unusual to see things wash up on the shore. I assumed it would just decompose like everything else, but then when I looked closer, I noticed something odd. It was moving, slowly, like it was alive. At first, I thought it was just the wind, pushing it gently, but when I leaned in for a closer look, the blob, if you could even call it that, seemed to pulse. There were small ripples in its surface, like it was breathing. I didn't know what to think. I stood there for a while, watching it, trying to make sense of it. Eventually, I turned and walked back home, brushing it off as some weird, harmless thing that had been caught in the water. But deep down, something about it unsettled me. Something about the way it pulsed, like it had a life of its own, made me uneasy. It wasn't long before others started noticing. The next day, people started talking about it. Everyone was saying they'd seen the blob, and some people had seen it in places where it shouldn't have been. More blobs were appearing all around the shore, on lawns near the water, even in the street. They weren't just on the lakefront, they were spreading. Some people thought it was just a bizarre weather phenomenon or some odd algae bloom, but it didn't make sense. These blobs weren't like anything we had seen before. They weren't just natural. There was something wrong about them. They didn't smell like algae, and they didn't feel like anything that should be coming from the water. Then, strange things started happening. There was a woman, Evelyn Moore, who lived on the edge of Oakville, not far from the lake. She had lived in the town her whole life, and everyone knew her. She was kind, always helping out at the church and baking pies for the local festivals. She loved the lake, and she used to walk by it every morning. One evening, she was walking home after a visit to a friend's house, and she saw a blob in her yard. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but as she walked closer, she saw the same strange movement I had seen, the pulsing like something alive. It wasn't long before Evelyn was found at her doorstep, incoherent, almost delirious. Her husband said she kept mumbling about the blob, saying it was watching her, following her. The doctors thought she was just stressed out, but I saw the look in her eyes when she tried to explain it. Something wasn't right. She couldn't explain what had happened, but she had seen something in those blobs. Something more than just a strange growth. Something that made her lose her sanity. She disappeared a few days later, and no one ever heard from her again. By the time I understood what was really happening, it was too late. The blobs were multiplying, spreading across the town like an infection. People were getting sick. Some had rashes. Others complained of dizziness, nausea, and headaches. The townsfolk began to panic, locking their doors at night, refusing to let their children play outside. The local authorities didn't know what to do. Scientists were called in, but they couldn't figure out what the blobs were made of. They ran tests, but nothing matched any known substance. What was worse, the blobs didn't just look strange, they started to change. At night, they became more active. I remember seeing one outside my window, wriggling on the lawn, like it was looking for something. And then I noticed something even worse. The way the blobs seemed to move toward the people. It was like they had a purpose, a direction. One evening I saw one slowly crawl toward the house next door, where Mr. and Mrs. Carrington lived. They were elderly, in their late 70s, and I watched in horror as the blob seemed to press itself against their front door, pushing through the cracks. A few hours later, the Carringtons were gone. Their house was locked, untouched, but they had vanished. No one saw them leave. It wasn't just the Carringtons. People were disappearing at an alarming rate. Whole families. The town was in chaos, with rumors flying that the blobs were alive, that they were somehow controlling the minds of the people they touched. Some said they could hear voices coming from them, low, like whispers, but there was no proof. Only fear. We were trapped, isolated by something we couldn't see or fight, and every day it spread further. Eventually, the military came in, setting up checkpoints around Oakville. They said they had a containment plan, but no one believed them. The blobs didn't care about barriers, they didn't care about anything. They kept spreading. By the time they decided to burn the whole town down to prevent the spread, Oakville had already become a ghost town. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed it whole, leaving only a few scattered survivors behind. I was one of them. I don't know what happened to the blobs after that. The town was left in ruins. But some people still say the blobs are out there, waiting. I hear whispers in the wind when I walk by the lake now, and sometimes, just sometimes, when the fog is thick enough, I think I see them again. Those strange, pulsing shapes moving just beneath the surface of the water. Maybe they never really left, or maybe they're waiting for the right moment, for the next summer when the town will return. But some people still say the blobs are out there, waiting. I hear whispers in the wind when I walk by the lake now, and sometimes, just sometimes, when the fog is thick enough, I think I see them again. Those strange, pulsing shapes moving just beneath the surface of the water. Maybe they never really left, or maybe they're waiting for the right moment, for the next summer when the town will return. Let's dive into fourth story of this time. It was 1994, and I was working as a nurse at Riverside General Hospital in Riverside, California. We were in the middle of a typical shift, nothing extraordinary about it. The heat of the summer had already taken hold, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with the heavy, dry air. The hospital was a busy place, but we managed. Like most hospitals, the staff was a mix of people, from doctors to technicians to nurses, all trying to get through their shifts and go home to their families. But nothing at all, could have prepared us for what happened on that fateful night. It started with Gloria Ramirez, a woman who was brought in after an apparent overdose. She was 31 years old, just a few years older than me. and she had been living with cervical cancer. Her condition had deteriorated quickly over the past few months, and it seemed like this would be the end of the line. We were used to seeing patients in their final days, but there was something about Gloria that night that was different. I remember her arrival so clearly. The emergency room was chaotic as usual. People shouting, machines beeping, nurses rushing from one corner to another. But when Gloria's stretcher was wheeled in, I felt a strange chill. Her body was limp, her face pale and contorted in pain, but there was something else, something hard to describe, a strange, almost metallic smell in the air. It wasn't something I could immediately place, but it was overpowering, like something unnatural had seeped into the room. I worked alongside my colleagues to stabilize her, setting up an IV and trying to get her vital signs under control. As we worked, something began to happen that none of us could explain. One of the nurses, Susan, had been working on Gloria's arm, trying to place an IV, when she suddenly froze. Her face turned pale, and she staggered back, her hand clutching her throat as if she couldn't breathe. The rest of us rushed to her, trying to figure out what was wrong, but before we could, she collapsed onto the floor. Just like that. No warning. She was unconscious, gasping for air, and it took several minutes for us to get her stable again. It didn't make sense. We were all confused, but we didn't have time to think about it. We had Gloria to focus on. But it wasn't long before another nurse, Tina, began to show symptoms: nausea, dizziness, a sense of disorientation. It felt like something was creeping into the room, something unseen. And then it happened again. Another nurse, another collapse. Panic started to spread through the ER. I stood back, watching, trying to make sense of it, but the room was in chaos. The smell, the strange metallic scent, was growing stronger, and the air seemed to thicken. The physicians had begun their work on Gloria as best they could, but their hands were shaking, their faces pale with confusion. It wasn't just the nurses anymore. One by one, more people started feeling sick, like they were succumbing to some sort of invisible poison. I'll never forget the moment when the doctors tried to put an oxygen mask on Gloria. As they did, a strange blue substance began to appear on her skin, her face, her arms. At first it looked like oil, but it wasn't. It shimmered in the light almost like it was glowing. It was as if her body was reacting to something, but we had no idea what. Her heart was barely beating. The machines beeped and whined as we tried to keep her alive, but her body was slipping away from us. The room had turned into a disaster. The staff was struggling to stay on their feet. Some were vomiting, some were shaking uncontrollably, and others were just standing there, frozen, staring at Gloria as if they had seen something they couldn't comprehend. As the hours passed, Gloria's condition worsened, and the blue substance began to spread. It coated her body, the IV lines, the bed, the entire room. It was as if the very air was contaminated. Finally, after what felt like forever, Gloria passed away. But the worst part was yet to come. It wasn't just that we had lost her. It was what happened after she died. Her body, which had been so lifeless moments before, began to release a strange, foul-smelling vapor. It wasn't like anything I've ever encountered before. It was thick, almost oily, and it clung to your skin, suffocating the air. We couldn't escape it. By then, the hospital staff was in full-blown panic. The emergency room had become a nightmare. People were crying, doctors were shouting for clean air, and the toxic smell was everywhere. We had no idea what was happening. Was it the medication? The cancer? Was it something Gloria had been exposed to before she came in? It was as if her death had unleashed something much darker, something that had taken over her body and now threatened us all. Later, after everything settled down, the authorities came in. They declared the area contaminated. They did what they could to clean the room, to decontaminate it, but no one could explain the events that had transpired. The autopsy showed that Gloria's body had contained high levels of dimethylsulfone, a chemical that's sometimes used in solvents and cleaning products. But how had it entered her bloodstream? And why had it caused such a reaction in the hospital? No one could answer those questions. The thing that haunts me to this day is the way the staff was affected. Those of us who had been in the room. Some of us were sick for weeks afterward, experiencing dizziness, headaches, and strange rashes. But what really stuck with me was the way it felt. Like something had been unleashed that night. Something that wasn't just a chemical or an illness. It was as if Gloria's body had somehow become a conduit for something far darker. Something toxic that reached out beyond the physical. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it had left a mark on all of us. I never spoke about it much after that night. Some people moved away, some quit their jobs. The hospital got back to normal in a way, but the memory of that evening stuck with me. I left Riverside General soon after, unable to shake the feeling that I had witnessed something I couldn't explain, something that didn't belong in this world. To this day, I don't know what happened to Gloria or why things unfolded the way they did. There are still whispers among the staff who were there that night. Some think it was a freak accident, something we'll never truly understand. But every time I close my eyes, I can still see the blue substance, the suffocating smell, and the horror in everyone's eyes as it all unfolded. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was something else. And I fear it's something that we may never fully escape. Please dive into fifth story of this time. It was just like any other evening in Setagaya, Tokyo during the winter of 2000. The air was crisp, and the streets were lightly dusted with snow. The kind of quiet, cold evening that made the town feel peaceful. Serene, even. I had lived in Setagaya for a few years, working as a local school teacher, and the neighborhood was the epitome of suburban normalcy. Safe, friendly, with people walking their dogs in the evening or gathering for the occasional festival. There was nothing out of the ordinary about the Tamura family. Father, mother, and 2 children, who lived a few doors down from me. I'd wave at them in passing, admire how they seemed to live a life of perfect simplicity, but I'll never forget the night everything changed. It was December 30th, when the first strange feeling crept into the neighborhood. I was sitting in my apartment, enjoying a quiet evening with my husband, when we saw the police cars racing by, their lights flashing against the snowy street. It was a strange sight, because there was never any real crime in Setagaya, at least not in the 15 years I'd been living there. Out of curiosity, I grabbed my coat, told my husband I'd be back in a few minutes, and stepped out to see what had happened. I remember walking down the street toward the Tamura family home, the one on the corner. As I approached, I noticed more police vehicles gathering around the house. There was a crowd of onlookers, their faces blurred by the flashing lights. The first thing I thought was that maybe there had been a robbery or some sort of domestic disturbance, but as I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There were people in hazmat suits walking in and out of the house. They were carrying something, I couldn't tell what, and the house was eerily silent, as if no one was home. I asked one of the officers what had happened, but he just told me to keep back, not to get too close. I did as I was told. But a heavy unease started to settle in. A few hours passed before word started to spread through the neighborhood. A neighbor who had lived across the street from the Tamuras told me that she had seen a man standing outside their house around midnight the previous night. She thought he was just someone walking their dog or a neighbor coming by. But when the police arrived and started looking through the house, things took a much darker turn. The Tamura family had been found murdered. The father, Hiroshi, had been killed in his sleep. His wife, Keiko, had been attacked violently in the living room, and their 2 children, Yuji, their son, and Ayumi, their daughter, were found in their beds, both of them killed as well. The worst part, the house didn't look like a crime scene at first. It didn't have the chaos you'd expect from a violent murder. No broken windows, no shattered furniture. It was as if the killer had come in methodically, silently, and done what he came to do. But the real horror wasn't even in the murders themselves, it was in the details. The way the killer had lingered. He didn't just kill them and leave. No. This person had stayed in the house for hours after. The police found strange, almost disturbing clues. There were traces of blood in areas of the house that didn't make sense, as if the killer had been watching. The family's phones had been used after the deaths. The calls traced to different parts of the city, but the man on the other end of the line never spoke. He only listened, like he was trying to recreate the sound of normalcy, to mimic what was once there. The most chilling detail came from the kitchen. The police discovered that someone had prepared a meal. A pot of rice was simmering, left on the stove, forgotten. The table was set as though the family had planned to eat together, but there were no signs of struggle. The strange part was how peaceful everything seemed, almost too peaceful. For days, the neighborhood was consumed by fear. Everyone was talking about it, trying to make sense of what had happened. Who could do something so horrendous in a place like Setagaya? Why the Tamura family? They weren't wealthy. They weren't involved in anything that would make them a target for such brutality. We were left with one terrifying thought. The killer could be anyone, and he was still out there, living among us. The police didn't have much to go on. No witnesses, no obvious motive, no DNA that led anywhere. The case was practically unsolvable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something, that maybe there was more to this than just a random act of violence. Then, something happened that made everything feel even more surreal. A week after the murders, I was walking to work when I passed by the Tamura house. It was still surrounded by police tape, the front door still cracked open, and the occasional officer walking in and out. I remember seeing the window on the second floor of their house, the curtains slightly drawn, and in that moment, I thought I saw something. No, someone, standing there. I froze, my heart pounding. The figure was barely visible, but it was there. I thought it was just my imagination, maybe the reflection of the streetlight on the glass, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still inside, watching us. I quickly turned away, walking briskly toward my school, but I couldn't forget that image. Later that day, when I spoke to one of the officers, he casually mentioned that there had been an unsettling discovery in the house. A piece of paper, an almost perfect list. It contained names, addresses, and other details about people in the neighborhood. At first I thought it was a joke, something to add to the mystery, but as the days went on, the more I learned about it, the more it unnerved me. These weren't just random notes. Some of the names listed had been of families who lived nearby. Some were people who had crossed paths with the Tamuras in the past. It was as if the killer had been planning for a long time. It was around this time that things started getting weirder. I began to notice people acting strangely in the neighborhood. People who had always been friendly, who had lived here for years, began to avoid one another. There were whispers about seeing figures in the shadows at night, of strange sounds coming from abandoned houses, of lights flickering in places where there should have been no power. The thought that the killer could be living among us, blending in with the people we had known for years, was terrifying. The police were doing what they could, but they were no closer to finding the killer. And every day, it felt like we were living in some sort of twisted waiting game. Waiting for the next terrible thing to happen, waiting for the killer to strike again. Months passed and the case slowly faded from the headlines. But for those of us who had lived through it, the fear never really went away. Setagaya was never the same after that night. The streets felt colder, the faces around me less familiar. I never went near the Tamura house again, but I'd see people gathered in hushed conversation about it, asking the same question: who could do something like that? And the answer, as much as we all dreaded it, was always the same. The killer was still out there, and no one knew who he was. To this day, no one knows what happened that night. The Setagaya family murders remain unsolved, a haunting puzzle that no one can piece together. The fear of that unknown killer lingers in the back of our minds, a reminder that in a place as ordinary as Setagaya, the most unspeakable horrors can happen when you least expect them. Let's dive into sixth story of this time. It was the winter of 1959, and I had just returned to the village of Evdel after spending several weeks in the nearby mountains, making my way through the Ural Range. I had been working with a few friends on a research project about local folklore and environmental conditions in the region. Nothing too out of the ordinary. We were just trying to document old stories from the surrounding villages, places where people still remembered the old ways of life, before the city had grown, before the government had pushed in. It was common to hear talk about the people who lived in the wilderness and how they had long since disappeared into the forests. One evening, while I was resting in the warmth of a friend's home in Ivdel, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. The conversation was hushed, as if no one wanted to say it out loud. The group I was sitting with, mostly hunters and lumberjacks, was talking about a group of students, 8 young adventurers from the city who had ventured deep into the mountains earlier that month, near the Dyatlov Pass. They were part of an expedition led by Igor Dyatlov, a bright and enthusiastic student from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. The expedition was supposed to be routine, a simple winter hiking trip. But there was no sign of them now. Their families had not heard from them, and the authorities had not been able to locate them. What struck me immediately, though, wasn't the fact that they were missing. It was how the people in the room were talking about it. There was an undeniable tension in their voices, as though they knew something dark, something beyond the usual explanation had taken place. One of the older men, a hunter named Mikhail, lowered his voice and spoke of it in hushed tones. He was close to the search parties and the military personnel who had been looking for the students. "They found their tent," Mikhail said, his voice shaking slightly. "But it was cut open from the inside. Not like an accident. Like they were running. Like something was chasing them." The others around the table grew silent. Even the fire seemed to quiet itself for a moment. You see, the students left in such a hurry that they left their belongings behind. Shoes, clothes. Some of them ran barefoot in the snow. It was like they were escaping from something. But what? Mikhail continued. "The searchers found their bodies weeks later, scattered in the snow, their clothes torn apart. Some of them, well, the way they were found, I sat there, staring at the fire, my mind racing. The image of students, running in fear, lost and freezing in the mountains, their bodies twisted in strange, unnatural ways. I couldn't shake it. There was something deeply unsettling about it all. I knew that the Dyatlov group had always been known for their ambition. They were experienced hikers and climbers. So why would they have panicked in such a way? So what could have made them cut their tent open from the inside in the middle of a freezing night? The next day, as I tried to get back to my work, I couldn't concentrate. The mention of the Dyatlov group haunted me. The more I tried to push it away, the more it gnawed at me. I needed to know what had really happened. I asked around, tried to gather any piece of information I could. It wasn't easy. There were too many conflicting stories. The authorities had kept a tight lid on the investigation, but word was starting to spread. And the more I dug, the more I realized that there were things about this tragedy that didn't add up. A few weeks after their bodies were found, the official report started coming in. The first thing that struck me was the state of their injuries. Some of them had broken bones, but not in a way you'd expect from a simple fall or accident. It was more like they'd been hit by something heavy, something far stronger than a human could be. But what disturbed me the most were the marks on their bodies. One of the students, a woman named Zinaida, had her tongue and eyes removed. There were no clear explanations. The rest of the group had injuries that suggested a violent struggle, but it was impossible to say who or what they were fighting. I decided I had to go up to the pass myself to see the place where it had all happened. The thought of it terrified me, but something inside me urged me to go, to find out for myself. It had been weeks since the incident, and the search parties had long since left the area. The mountains were quiet now, silent, the snow resting in soft blankets over everything. As I hiked up to the pass, I felt the same unease that had taken over the village that winter. There was something oppressive about the mountains, something that made the air feel too still, the kind of stillness that makes you feel as if you're being watched. I found the remains of their camp. The tent was still there, or what was left of it, buried beneath the snow. It had been shredded, just as Mikhail had said. But it didn't look like an accident. The cuts in the fabric were too precise, too deliberate. I could almost feel the panic of the group in the air around me. Then I found something strange. Beneath the snow, hidden away, were a few footprints. These were not the footprints of hikers. They were too wide, too heavy. I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked at them. Something didn't add up. The footprints seemed to have come from the direction of the forest, toward the place where the students had set up their camp. But the way they were scattered, disjointed, as though someone or something had been chasing them. It sent a shiver through my bones. I spent hours at the site, searching for any clue that might explain what had happened. But the more I looked, the more I realized that there was no explanation that would make sense. The wind picked up as the sun began to set, and I knew it was time to leave. But as I made my way back down the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing footsteps behind me, breaking through the snow, but whenever I turned, that night as I camped in a small hut, trying to warm myself from the cold, I kept hearing the sounds again. The footsteps, closer this time. I looked out into the dark forest, but saw nothing. The next morning, I left as quickly as I could. When I returned to the village, I didn't speak much about what I had seen. How could I explain the feeling that something unnatural had happened up there, that the mountains had claimed something from the students, something that was never meant to be found? The Dyatlov Pass incident remains unsolved, a mystery that has haunted the Ural Mountains for decades. No one knows for certain what happened to Igor Dyatlov and his group of adventurers. There are many theories, some plausible, others absurd, but none that truly answer the question, what drove them to flee their tent that night in the dead of winter and meet such a horrific fate. But I can tell you this, there's something about the mountains, something ancient and unsettling, that's hard to shake. And though I'm no longer in Idel, I still hear the whispers, the rumors, that the spirits of the lost students wander those mountains, forever searching for answers that may never come. It's a haunting feeling, knowing that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Let's dive into seventh story of this time. It was late in the winter of 1922, a cold, biting season, when I first heard the whispers about Hinterkaifeck. I was still just a young man then, living in the small Bavarian village of Grobern, which sat in the rolling hills, far enough from the cities to feel the isolation of country life. People here were simple. Farmers, craftsmen, shepherds. And the town, though tight-knit, had always been quiet, with a rhythm dictated by the seasons. You could always trust your neighbor, they'd say. A hard-working people, honest folk, the kind of people who didn't ask for trouble. But then there was Hinterkaifeck, a lonely farmstead tucked away in the forest, nearly a mile from the nearest house. I remember the first time I heard about the place. It was a spring evening when the whole village gathered at the local tavern for the weekly drink. The beer was flowing and the men were talking about their work, as usual. But that night, the conversation turned strange. You see, Hinterkaifeck hadn't been seen for a while. The last time I'd passed the farm was weeks ago. It wasn't much of a place. Old decaying buildings, overgrown fields, and a single farmhouse that looked like it hadn't been tended to in years. I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone knew the family that lived there. Andreas Gruber, the farmer, and his family, his wife, Kazelia, their daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children, who were barely more than infants. They lived a quiet life, out of sight of the rest of us. The farmstead wasn't even marked on most maps, but we all knew it was there, and we all knew the family was strange. And yet, no one thought too much of them, until they stopped showing up in the village altogether. People began to notice that the Grubers hadn't come to market for their goods. The children hadn't been seen playing in the village square. Andreas hadn't been by to pick up his tools. Weeks went by, and the silence stretched across the land like a heavy blanket. I remember it was an old woman, Mrs. Helga, who finally spoke up. She had always been one to gossip, but there was something about her voice that night. She leaned over the table, her breath smelling of stale schnapps, and spoke in a whisper. "They've gone quiet, haven't they?" she said, nodding her head slowly toward the door, as if she were afraid someone might hear. "The Grubers, the farm hasn't sent word for weeks now, nothing." The conversation shifted, the topic of the Grubers taking center stage. The villagers murmured to each other, exchanging nervous glances. There were rumors, of course, but nothing concrete. Perhaps they had left for the city, or maybe the old man had grown ill and the family had gone to help him. But there was something strange about the way they had just disappeared. People who lived out there, in that isolated place, tended to take care of their own business. They didn't just vanish like that. It wasn't until a few days later, when the neighbors went to check on the farm, that everything took a turn for the worse. The police were called, and the entire village buzzed with whispers. The next morning, the men of Grobern went to Hinterkaifeck, eager to see what had happened. When they arrived at the farm, they found the door to the house slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. But the sight inside, it was enough to turn any man's stomach. The house was in disarray, the furniture upturned, and there was a thick, suffocating silence. And then they found the bodies. Andreas Gruber was dead, lying near the front door, his head shattered. His wife, Kazelia, was found in the kitchen, her throat slit wide open. The daughter, Victoria, had been murdered in her own bed, her body ravaged, as if something had attacked her violently. The children, both of them, had been killed too. horridly huddled together in the corner of the room. But what was even more unsettling was the fact that there were no signs of struggle. No blood spilled on the floor where you'd expect it. No marks on the doors or windows. The walls were pristine. It was as if they had been killed without a single sound. But that wasn't even the worst part. When the searchers finally looked upstairs, they found a chilling detail. There was someone else in the house. Someone who had been hiding in the attic the entire time. The grainy, dust-filled attic with its musty air and creaking beams. They had missed him, or her, when they'd first looked through the house. The killer, whoever they were, had spent days in that house with the bodies of the Gruber family, watching, waiting. The neighbors discovered footprints in the snow leading up to the farmhouse. They were fresh, but they seemed to disappear just outside the barn, as though whoever was there had known how to cover their tracks. It didn't take long for the rumors to swirl. Some said it was the work of bandits, men who'd come through the hills, taking what they wanted and leaving destruction in their wake. Others claimed it was a family dispute, that Victoria's father had killed them all in a fit of rage before taking his own life. But the strangest story, the one that kept me awake at night, was that there was something unnatural at work here. Something old. Something that had never left the land. Something that had finally come for the Grubers. The search continued for weeks, but the killer was never found. There were no leads, no evidence to go on, and the police, they were as baffled as the rest of us. There was nothing that made sense, nothing that could explain the brutality of the murders. The killer's movements were too strange, too calculated, as if they had known the farm intimately, like they had lived there before. As the months passed, Hinterkaifeck was abandoned, left to fall into ruin. The land grew overgrown, the house fell apart, and the villagers grew more and more uneasy about the place. No one went near it. It was as though something had cursed it, as though the land had swallowed the Gruber's secrets and hidden them beneath layers of snow and rotting timber. I still remember the last time I walked by the farm. It was late in the evening, the sky darkening and the cold biting at my cheeks. I was walking back from a late visit to a neighboring village, and the wind had picked up. The woods surrounding the farm felt different that night, darker somehow, like they were closing in. I had never seen the place look so desolate, almost as though it had never been inhabited at all. But then, just as I passed the property line, I saw something that made my heart race. It was a figure standing by the window, looking out from the second floor. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence. A chill swept through me, and I found myself standing there, staring up at that window, waiting for something to happen. But it didn't. The figure remained still, watching, like it was waiting for me to leave. I didn't stay long after that. I turned and hurried back to the village, my mind racing with 1,000 questions, each one darker than the last. The Hinterkaifeck murders were never solved. No answers came, and for years, the name Hinterkaifeck became a hushed whisper in the village. A warning, a story told by the fireside to keep children from wandering too far into the night. Even now, decades later, I still hear the rumors. Some say the place is haunted, that the spirits of the Grubers still walk those fields, seeking justice. Others say the killer is still out there, hiding in the woods, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I don't know what's true. All I know is this: every time the wind howls through the trees near Hinterkaifeck, I can't help but wonder if the darkness that consumed that farm all those years ago has ever truly left. Let's dive into 8th story of this time. I remember the first time I laid eyes on Elisa Lam. It was early February of 2013, and I had just started working as a janitor at the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. The place had a reputation, to say the least. Long before I got the job, I'd heard the stories of strange occurrences, of troubled guests, and of a history that clung to the walls like dust. The hotel wasn't a place for the average tourist. It attracted people down on their luck, or those looking for something darker. You could feel it in the air, a heaviness, like the building itself had secrets it wanted to keep hidden. Elisa Lamb wasn't like the other guests. She was young, early 20s, a backpacker from Canada, staying for a few days while she explored the city. She didn't belong to the typical crowd that came through the Cecil's doors, at least not from what I could tell. She was a quiet girl, often seen alone, walking the halls with her big suitcase, her eyes downcast, as if she were trying to keep to herself. I didn't know much about her back then. I knew she'd been staying at the hotel for a few days, but we didn't really interact. I was just a janitor, sweeping up, mopping the floors, keeping things clean. It was only when she started acting a little strange that I began to notice her more. She'd be in the lobby, staring out the window, her face expressionless. But there was something unsettling about the way she stood there, almost as if she were waiting for someone or something. I didn't know much about mental health back then, but something about Elisa's behavior felt off. She'd wander the halls at odd hours, sometimes knocking on the doors of rooms that were clearly unoccupied. Other times, she'd stand in front of the elevator, pressing the button repeatedly, waiting for the doors to open, but they never did. The elevator was another oddity. There were always strange stories about it, people saying it was haunted or malfunctioning. I'd heard it creak and groan in the dead of night, though no one was ever inside. Maybe it was just the building settling, maybe not. But Elisa, she seemed fascinated by it. I'll never forget the night she got into the elevator, alone, and pressed every button. The doors opened and closed repeatedly, but she didn't seem alarmed. She didn't even look surprised. She just stood there staring at the buttons, as if she were waiting for something, or someone, to come through. That night was the last time anyone saw her alive. I don't know if it was just coincidence or if something darker was at play, but after Elisa disappeared, the atmosphere in the hotel shifted. The guests didn't seem to talk about her much, but I could tell they were uneasy, as if they'd felt something had gone wrong. It wasn't until a few days later that the police arrived. I was sweeping the lobby when the detectives walked in, asking questions, trying to figure out what happened. They were polite, but there was an urgency in their voices. They knew something was off about the whole situation, but no one could explain why Elisa had vanished. At first, the police didn't have much to go on. No one had seen her leave the building. No one could remember if she'd checked out. Her room was locked, and her belongings were still inside. The hotel staff was questioned, myself included, but we all had the same story. Elisa had been a quiet guest, nothing out of the ordinary. The police scoured the hotel, checking security footage, but they didn't find much at first. Then, several weeks later, they discovered something that sent chills down my spine. They found Elisa's body in the water tank on the roof. The discovery was so strange, so utterly bizarre, that I couldn't wrap my mind around it. How had she gotten up there? The roof was off limits to guests, and there were no signs of forced entry. The police said it had to be an accident, that maybe Elisa had wandered up to the roof and somehow fallen into the tank. But that didn't sit right with me. The whole thing felt wrong, like there was something more to it that no one was willing to talk about. The autopsy results didn't help much either. Elisa's death was ruled as accidental, but they couldn't explain how she ended up in the water tank. They said there were no signs of foul play, but the circumstances surrounding her death felt far too strange to be a simple accident. What really unsettled me was how her body was found. The water in the tank had been contaminated, and the guests who had been drinking it hadn't noticed anything unusual at first. Some complained that the water tasted off, but no one could have guessed what had happened. But it wasn't just the discovery of Elisa's body that haunted me. It was what came after. Weeks later, the hotel management started getting calls from people asking about Elisa. The press was relentless, but they didn't seem interested in the real story. They focused on the most bizarre details, making theories about her behavior, her mental state, about the supernatural. The rumors, of course, spun out of control. People said the hotel was cursed, that Elisa's spirit was trapped inside the building. The whole place began to take on an eerie quality, as if the building itself had become infected by what had happened. I started having dreams. At first, they were vague, shadows lurking in the corners of the hotel. But the more I thought about Elisa, the more I began to see her in my dreams. She was standing at the end of the hall, just like I'd seen her many times before, except now her eyes were wide open, fixed on me. But when I got closer, she wouldn't move. She wouldn't speak. She'd just stare, unblinking. And then I'd hear the elevator doors opening and closing, even though no one was inside. I would always wake up just before I could reach her, and every morning I'd feel this heavy dread hanging over me. And then came the video. The one that I couldn't stop watching no matter how much I tried to look away. It was the security footage from the hotel's elevator, showing Elisa in the moments before she disappeared. You've probably seen it by now, her strange, erratic behavior. The way she presses the buttons, the way she ducks in and out of the elevator, as if she's hiding from something or someone. It was like she knew something was following her, something she couldn't see. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to that video than just a young woman losing control. What struck me the most, though, wasn't just her behavior in the elevator. It was the way she seemed to disappear into the dark, as if she were walking towards something far worse than anything we could imagine. I don't know what happened to Elisa Lam. There are so many theories. Some say it was a mental breakdown. Others say it was something supernatural, something tied to the hotel's dark history. But whatever it was, I know that Elisa's story didn't end when her body was found in that water tank. The hotel, now more infamous than ever, became a place where people came to seek answers, but they left with more questions. And for me, every time I pass the Cecil, every time I step into its dimly lit halls, there's a lingering feeling, like Elisa's still out there, walking through the halls, waiting for someone to see what she saw, to understand what she knew before it was too late. I still hear the echoes of the elevator doors opening and closing, and sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I see her there at the end of the hall. But when I blink, she's gone. Let's dive into 9th story of this time. It was the early months of 2007, and I had just moved to the Midwest for a job with a tech company. The city was small, not quite a bustling metropolis, but enough to offer a new start. I didn't know much about the place before moving in, but after a few weeks, I had gotten comfortable. I had settled into a tiny apartment, started making some friends, and even found a few spots I liked to hang out. Local bars, a couple of late-night diners, the usual. Life was moving at a steady pace, and everything seemed fine, at least on the surface. Then, one evening, things started to change. It was a Friday, right before the start of a long weekend. I was walking home after work when I ran into Alex, a guy from the office who'd been friendly, but we never hung out much outside of work. He had a few drinks in him that evening, nothing too out of the ordinary. And as we talked about nothing in particular, he suddenly dropped something odd. "You ever hear of the smiley face killers?" he asked, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. I paused, confused, but before I could answer, Alex went on. He told me about a disturbing series of deaths that had been making waves, particularly in college towns. He said it was becoming a sort of urban legend, a theory that a group of killers was behind the deaths of several young men, most of them college-aged. According to the theory, the victims, seemingly drowning accidents, were lured by the killers to some secluded water source where they were disposed of, and then later, smiley faces were found nearby. I remember laughing it off, thinking it was just one of those bizarre, almost comical conspiracy theories. The idea that someone could get away with something like that seemed far-fetched. I had never even heard of this before, but after Alex mentioned it, I did some quick Googling, and sure enough, there were reports, news articles, forums, even documentaries. The names kept popping up. The victims were from different cities, different backgrounds, but the pattern was there. Young men, all found in rivers or lakes, drowned, but with strange circumstances surrounding their deaths. Over the next few weeks, the thought of these smiley face killers lingered in the back of my mind, though I didn't think much of it at the time. It seemed too unreal, too sensationalized, like the stuff of crime novels or movies. That was until one night I got a call from my friend Sarah. "Did you hear about Ben?" she asked, her voice shaking. Ben was a friend of ours, a guy I'd met a few times through mutual friends. He was an athlete, fit, with a good sense of humor. He had just graduated from college, and while he was adjusting to life outside of school, he was the type who always stayed out late with his buddies, enjoying the city's nightlife. Ben had gone out with some friends that night, but when they got separated in the bar, no one had seen him leave. The next morning, his body was found in a nearby river. His shoes neatly placed beside him. He had drowned. The police thought it was an accident. Maybe alcohol played a part, but it was too soon to tell. I couldn't stop thinking about the smiley faces Alex had mentioned, but I didn't say anything to Sarah. It was all too bizarre, too out there to even entertain as a real possibility. The funeral was small, a quiet affair in the local church. Ben's family was devastated, of course, but there was an air of confusion. No one really had any answers. No one knew what happened, except that he had disappeared after a night out and then he turned up dead. After that, the rumors grew. I started hearing whispers from people I didn't even know about the strange circumstances surrounding Ben's death. Some people mentioned the smiley face on a wall near the riverbank, a place where the police said Ben's body had been found. A simple, drawn smiley face sprayed onto the concrete underpass near the water. I didn't want to believe it. It sounded insane, but the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. Then, things got even stranger. I started noticing them. The smiley faces. It wasn't just the one by the river. There were more. Tags, graffiti, even carvings in trees. The more I paid attention, the more I realized how many of these things were popping up around the city. Sometimes they were small, just a simple yellow circle with two eyes and a curved line for a mouth. But other times the faces were larger, ominous, with jagged lines and crooked eyes, almost mocking in their simplicity. I began to feel like I was going insane, like I was being haunted by these stupid little drawings. I couldn't explain why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they meant something. Something more than just some random graffiti. Weeks later, another body turned up. This time, it was Kyle, a guy I'd met once at a local bar. Kyle was the life of the party, always cracking jokes, making everyone laugh. He was another one of those guys who just seemed to float through life effortlessly. But he had been missing for 3 days before his body was found in a shallow pond on the outskirts of the city. No one had seen him leave the bar. His friends said they'd lost track of him, but when the police found him, they made a chilling discovery. Just like with Ben, the smiley face was drawn near the spot where Kyle was found. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I knew I had to look deeper. I began reaching out to the people who had been talking about the smiley face killers. Piecing together stories from around the country, I learned about the pattern, how young men, typically athletic, outgoing types, had disappeared in various college towns all over the United States, only to be found days later in water, often with these same disturbing symbols nearby. Some were found with no obvious cause of death, while others had injuries that didn't quite add up. There were theories, of course. Some believed the victims were targeted because they were vulnerable, too trusting, or simply out of place. Others thought it was some kind of sick initiation ritual, an underground group marking their kills with the smiley faces. Whatever it was clear that this wasn't just random. It was methodical, chillingly deliberate. But it was what I learned next that completely shattered me. One night, I met with a group of other locals who had been following the same trail I was. People who were convinced there was something much darker at play here. We met in secret, at a bar down a narrow alley, away from prying eyes. That night, someone who had been in touch with a retired detective showed us some shocking photos. They were of crime scenes, dozens of them, from different places, different states, and in each one, there it was, the same symbol, the smiley face drawn somewhere near the victim. It was eerie how consistent it was. Some were drawn in blood, others just hastily scrawled with spray paint, but the pattern was unmistakable. I'll never forget the look on the faces of the people around me that night. Fear, confusion, disbelief. We didn't know what to make of it, but we knew this wasn't just a coincidence anymore. Something or someone was playing a deadly game, and we were all caught in its grip. As the weeks went on, more bodies turned up. More young men, all found in water, with the same eerie symbol nearby. The city grew more and more tense. People started looking over their shoulders, wondering who would be next. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the faces, the victims, the terrible truth that no one seemed willing to confront. I don't know who's behind the smiley faces. Some say it's a gang, a cult, or a group of sick individuals who get off on the terror they cause. But the more I dug, the more I realized that there's something deeply unsettling about this whole thing. The smiles, they weren't just symbols of joy. They were mocking, taunting us, as if the killers were right there in plain sight, and we couldn't see them. It's been years since Ben's death, since Kyle's, since everything started to unravel, and I still can't shake the feeling that something is lurking just out of view. Maybe I'll never know the full truth. Maybe the smiley face killers will always be just a mystery. But every time I walk through the city, past the water, past the walls, past the trees, I see them again. The smiling faces, hiding in the shadows, waiting. And I can't help but wonder who they'll come for next. Now we dive into today, final story of this time. I had always dreamed of moving out of the city. My wife Rachel and I had spent years living in a cramped apartment in Jersey City with the constant buzz of traffic, honking horns, and the hum of construction. It was a place for young professionals, but we were tired of it. We wanted peace. We wanted space. So after months of searching, we found the perfect house in Westfield, a small, picturesque town in New Jersey. It felt like a step toward a fresh start. The house was old but beautiful, with a wide front porch, a sprawling backyard, and mature trees that surrounded the property, giving it a quiet, secluded feel. It had charm, history, and, most importantly, it was far from the noise of the city. Rachel was excited. So was I. We spent our weekends painting walls, unpacking boxes, and getting to know the neighborhood. We met a few of the neighbors, kind people who offered advice and shared stories about the town. It felt like a dream come true. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The days were peaceful and nights were calm, with just the occasional creak of the house settling. But after a few weeks, something started to feel off. It was a late evening in early July when I first noticed something strange. Rachel had gone to visit her sister, so I was home alone, finishing up some work. The house was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. I took a break and stepped outside to the front porch to get some fresh air. As I stood there, enjoying the quiet, I noticed a car slowly driving by. Nothing unusual in itself, except it wasn't a car I recognized. It was a dark sedan, moving slowly, almost deliberately past our house. The driver didn't seem to be in any hurry, just creeping along the street. I couldn't see the driver's face, but something about the way the car moved unnerved me. It wasn't until it passed and turned the corner that I dismissed the feeling and went back inside. The next day, the same car passed by again. And the day after that, I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but something about it felt deliberate. It wasn't the type of street where people would just drive by slowly like that. It was more of a residential area with tight-knit houses and little through traffic. I told Rachel about it that evening, but she just shrugged it off. Probably just someone checking out the neighborhood, she said. I wanted to believe that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences continued. The same car would drive by, sometimes several times a day, and I began noticing something even stranger. Someone was standing across the street, just watching the house. It wasn't consistent, but at odd hours I'd look out the window and see a figure standing at the end of the block, just standing still, staring at our house. The figure was always in shadow, too far away for me to get a good look at, but every time I saw it, a chill would run down my spine. I started to bring it up more, but Rachel still dismissed it. You're just adjusting to the new house, she'd say. It's probably just your imagination. But I wasn't so sure. It wasn't until a week later that things took a much darker turn. I had been out running errands when I returned home and noticed something off. The front door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it that morning, but the door was open, just a crack. I stepped inside, cautiously, calling out for Rachel, but there was no response. The house was empty, but it felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I walked through each room, looking for any sign of a break-in. Nothing seemed out of place. No windows were open, no drawers were pulled out, but something felt off. It was like a quiet unease in the air. I checked the back door. I checked the garage, the windows, and even the basement. Everything was secure, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. That night, after Rachel returned home, I couldn't stop talking about it. I told her everything. The open door, the strange figure watching the house, the feeling of being followed. She was starting to look concerned, but still, she didn't fully believe me. "Maybe you just forgot to lock the door," she suggested. But I knew it wasn't just that. I knew something was wrong. Over the next few days, I installed security cameras around the property, hoping to catch anything strange on film. That's when I saw it. On one of the camera feeds, I noticed something odd. A dark figure in the backyard, just standing in the shadows. Barely visible, but unmistakably there. It was the same figure I had seen watching from across the street, but this time, it was closer. It was standing right outside the fence, staring directly at the house. I couldn't see its face, but I felt like it was looking at me. It was as though this person was waiting for something, maybe even watching for when we'd be asleep. I showed Rachel the footage that night, and she was finally scared. I think it was the first time she realized that I wasn't making this up. She wanted to call the police, but we didn't know how to explain it. There was no proof of anything, just a figure in the yard, barely visible, and the feeling of being watched. But as the days went by, it got worse. The car would drive by more frequently, and sometimes I'd see the figure standing outside at night, sometimes even closer than before, peering through the trees. I was terrified, and then, one afternoon, as I was coming back from the store, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There on the front porch was a letter. No return address, no stamp, just a single sheet of paper inside a plain envelope. I opened it, and my hands trembled as I read the words written in messy, uneven handwriting. "I've been watching you. I know what you're doing. I'll be close when you least expect it." The words were simple, but they carried an undeniable weight. It felt like a direct threat. I immediately called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing more to go on. The figure had vanished. The car had stopped driving by. It was as if the person, or whatever it was, knew exactly when to retreat. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that they were still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. Over the next few weeks, the strange events only escalated. I started waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was in the house, watching us as we slept. I would hear faint tapping on the windows, or the faintest creak of footsteps on the porch. The security cameras caught nothing, but I knew, deep down, that someone was there. Every time I tried to leave, the feeling of being followed was overwhelming, as if someone was always right behind me, just out of sight. Rachel and I started to become reclusive, rarely leaving the house. We began locking every door, checking the windows several times a night, but no matter how much we tried to protect ourselves, the unease lingered. It was as if the watcher was always there, somewhere in the shadows, never far enough for us to feel safe. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, staring out the window, when I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A face. It wasn't clear at first, but it was unmistakable. A face in the window across the street, just barely visible behind the curtains, staring directly at us. I froze, unable to look away, and in that moment I realized something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just one person watching us, it was a whole group. I don't know if we'll ever know who they were or why they targeted us. But what I do know is this: the watcher is still out there, still waiting. And every day, every night, I feel their eyes on me, as if they are always watching, just beyond the corner of my vision. And I can't help but wonder if I'll ever truly be safe again. That is all for today. If you enjoyed the stories, please like, share, and subscribe to Dark Imagine, and don't forget to hit the bell icon for latest stories.